Avoid layout tables. Accessibility in Practice, Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. Today we're going to talk about avoiding layout tables. Layout tables are tables used purely for visual layout purposes. Alternatively, data tables, or tables that include data, like employment data or statistics, are tables that have very clear information, like headers and data cells, and are the best use of tables for accessible information. Layout tables are not a good use of tables for information. On my screen, I have an example of a layout table. This is a table of questions for an interview. I have two columns, A and B, and I have 9 rows. The first row is questions for an interview, and the first row actually spans both columns A and B in a merged cell, which is another no-no we don't do in accessibility. Under questions for an interview, my two columns have, in the first column, numbers 1 through 8, and in the second column, questions. And these are all questions I would ask in an interview. For a visual learner, it's very obvious. This is a list of questions that I'm going to ask my interviewee in my interview. However, for someone who is reading this using a screen reader, it doesn't quite make sense where or why I would use this as a table. For instance, why not just use this as a list in a document? I have 8 questions. I have 8 cells for the number of questions I have, and I have 8 questions in 8 other cells for another row of data cells. That's kind of an odd use of a table. Another way to think about this is to think about chess. When thinking of data tables, or tables in general, and accessibility, I like to think of using chess as a good example. When I'm playing chess, I'm actually playing in a grid, and all of my grid has specific places and locations. For example, the very first row and column in my table grid is always going to be A1. A1 is my first location in my table, in any table that I'm going to use. But if I wanted to send my pawn to A1, for example, I couldn't do that because in this particular table, I have a merged cell that's merged with A and B over row 1. So in this case, it's difficult for me to be able to tell a screen reader user what these two columns represent because 1, they're not labeled very correctly, and 2, I have merged information. So when I'm navigating this chessboard of a table, it's very difficult to understand why I have laid it out in this format. For instance, if I unmerged these cells, then I'm left with 2 different cells, A1 and B1 at the very top. But now I need to label these first 2 cells with the information that would be called headers for my following parts of my table. So under A, the rest of my rows would be number, for example, because that's the number of questions I have, 1 through 8. And then B column would be questions in terms of my interview questions, or I could even call it interview questions. But again, it seems silly to have this table as a layout table because it's just listing the number, which if I have a table, I already know the number of rows there already is, so it's kind of redundant. And then also, it's just listing a list of questions. Instead, what I would want to do is I would want to create a document So I'm opening a Google document. I would want to type in interview questions, and then I would want to create a numbered list with my questions associated. So I'm going to copy my questions over into this numbered list, starting with 1. Now I'm on 2. I'm copying the second, and then the third, and so on. So this actually makes a lot more sense. I'm not purely using this table now as a visual tool. I am actually listing out the interview questions in an appropriate list format, because now it is navigable. I can use my screen reader or my keyboard to navigate up and down my list, and it's very easy to know how many list items that I have. I am not dealing with data, so I don't need to worry about adding in certain data parameters or understanding what type of data I'm using. It's just a list of questions. So in this case, I'm going to avoid using a table whatsoever, because if I were to use a table, it would only be for visual layout purposes. In conclusion, in order to make an accessible table, the first question we want to ask ourselves is this a data table or a layout table? If it's a layout table, if this is a table purely for visual purposes only, let's try not to make it a table and instead use some type of document or composition format like a list, a bulleted list, a paragraph, or some kind of text, instead of using a table, because a table is really meant for conveying data. And that's it. That's how to avoid layout tables. Find more videos on our YouTube channel at CDLE_DLSS.